It was a dark night, the beginning of a classic setting for dark deeds. While it was winter, it was a still, chilly night, lacking the traditional howling wind, biting cold, and skulking dark creatures. The leafless trees were rimed with frost, and afternoons light rain freezing in cold temperatures. It was also the depths of rural Wiltshire, home of the well-to-do and a large amount of the British Army. A respectable area, which included a small and moderately wooded valley, in which was situated a large, stately, and eminently respectable home, occupied by a moderately sized, stately, and eminently respectable, at first sight, family. The lights inside were on, and if you happened to be in the grounds, you might hear the sounds of chatter and drinks being had within. All very nice and cozy, until you found out what they were chatting about. The chances of you even getting past the deadly dangerous wards and the chimera and Nundu on the property were low. The chances of being able to hear are even lower. The chances of surviving hearing are so low as to be nearly non-existent. So, Lucius, why have you invited us here to this fantastic elf-made wine 67, isn't it? And why haven't you invited these people? Avery asked, gesturing with his wine glass at the group around him. Lucius Malfoy, Lord of Malfoy Manor, former spy master of the Dark Lord Voldemort, smiled. The group Avery had gestured to was a collection of his old contacts. Not quite complete, of course. Only those he could be reasonably certain would agree with him in his planned course of action. They were an unlikely collection of rogues. Former Death Eaters sat side by side with werewolves, Muggle terrorists, superhuman criminals, and non-wanded practitioners of dark magic. 33, actually, he said mildly. And I have called you here for a number of reasons. First, however, I would like to start with a question. What are we doing? His clever, intense grey eyes, so like his son's, swept around the room. We former Death Eaters hide who we are. The werewolf packs stick to uninhabited areas and avoid even Muggles save the full moon. Organizations such as Hydra have been driven into the shadows in the history books. Practitioners of all sorts have been forced to hide who they are for fear of retribution. He sat back. But once, this was different. All of us who are connected to the magical world once thrived. Hydra was once the terror of Europe, part of the mighty Duumvirate with the Grindelwald that nearly toppled the world order. Now, we skulk, we hide, and we hope to avoid the all-seeing eye of Nicholas Fury and the wrath of his avengers. S.H.I.E.L.D.'s power is undisputed. Albus Dumbledore, meanwhile, contaminates the minds of our young, and holds more power than a fool such as he deserves, being feted as the greatest wizard of his time when he does not deserve it, for that title belongs to another. He looked at the group, daring any of them to dispute this. None did. One of the Avengers' great strengths is their ability to act in concert. Somehow they work together as smoothly as a well-oiled machine, and they achieve far more than they would alone, as we once did. And that is what I propose we do. Not snorted. And I thought Bellatrix was the mad one. Lucius cocked an eyebrow. Oh? You want us to band together, in a time of peace, when we have public respect and prosperity, to take on a group that commands more raw power than the world has ever seen, and has two members who despise each and every one of us. In case you've forgotten, Lucius, it was the Dark Lord who killed the mudblood wife of Thor, who happens to be the god of thunder, as well as retaining his considerable magical powers. James Potter was one of the strongest wizards of his generation, poor taste notwithstanding. Not said bluntly. From his encounter with Severus, it's clear that he bears us a considerable grudge. That said, he seems content to live and let live. Or he has decided that he merely can wait to murder us at his leisure, Lucius murmured. Not, we are talking about a being who can control the weather, all over the world, at will. He can kill us any time he wishes, and if I remember my histories correctly, the Norse pantheon is very big on blood feuds. Why kill us immediately when he can wait and draw out our deaths? That doesn't sound like James Potter, let alone Thor, Avery muttered. But it does sound like Loki, Von Strucker interjected. And my informants tell me that Thor follows his brother's advice very closely. The implication that Thor would take a few pages from Loki's playbook was not lost on anyone. There was a round of shivers. Loki was not someone anyone with a brain wished to cross. Even if what you say is true, Nott said slowly, we don't have the power to fight even Loki alone. He built Hogwarts. He taught the Founders. The Avengers were formed to stop him, and it took every single one of them. How can we fight that when we can't even fight Dumbledore? We can fight Dumbledore. If we overcome our fears, and working together, working slowly, we can do it. Hydra, Lucius said, indicating Von Strucker and Zemo, has the resources and manpower to strike at the Avengers and S.H.I.E.L.D. They have already done so. Lucius looked at Nott. You are right. We are prosperous, and that money is doing nothing. We owe it to our forefathers to find our Lord, and he is still alive, believe me, I know, and restore him. While we do so, I suggest that we fund Hydra and put Greyback's people at their disposal. They can wear down the Avengers, if not destroy them entirely, clearing the path for our Lord's return in an alliance that will shake the citadels of the gods. Lucius eyed the Death Eaters. They were the tricky ones. Greyback could be bullied if blood and power were not enough to entice him, and Hydra were already on side. But if he had them, then the fun would begin. The personal risk will be limited. For one thing, we cannot act openly as we once did. Not yet. You're scared? Of the Avengers? No. Merely wary, as one is around a well-trained attack animal. No, of the man who holds their leash. Agent Fury of S.H.I.E.L.D., Nott said, a cruel half-smile on his lips. Lucius schooled his face into blankness with difficulty. Director, actually. Why would I be afraid of that pathetic muggle? He gave you that limp, Nott said. He snapped your wand and nearly burned down your house. And I took his eye, Lucius said, teeth gritted, gripping his glass in a vice grip. Your point, Nott? That you don't want to move publicly because you think he'll come after you personally. The rest of us be damned, Nott said. That is a lie, Nott. One I might call you out for if we did not have bigger problems. The simple facts are these, Lucius said coldly. The light is in the ascendants. The Avengers, S.H.I.E.L.D., and that twinkly-eyed old fool have their metaphorical wand to our throats. Hydra have agreed to work with us against the Avengers. All that will be required of you is gold that you aren't using, possibly your contacts in the Ministry to quietly curry support, and your cooperation in the search for our Lord. I do not require much, and I dare say you can easily deny it if asked by the bumbling fools at the Auror office. If not, you will be faced with the prospect of our Lord's wrath when he returns. You say when, Yaxley said. How do you know he's even alive? Because of me. Everyone turned to the hooded figure who had just spoken. Until now, he had been watching and listening, sipping his wine with an air of mild amusement, as if at the antics of children. What little of his face was visible from beneath the shadows of the black hood was deathly pale. It smiled, or more accurately, revealed its teeth. I am a master of that which is dead, and that which is in between. Your master falls into the latter category. He inclined his head, briefly. I am Gravemoss, and I can tell that your lord and master still lives. Weak, true, alone, for now. It is not only possible to return him to physical form, it is easy. He lives, Death Eaters. What are you? Nott asked slowly. Gravemoss threw back his head and laughed, revealing a few locks of white hair and glimmering red eyes beneath the hood. The red eyes reminded many of Voldemort before his fall, except that this man, or whatever he was, seemed to be of a different stripe. Just, however, as dangerous, if not more so. A man of magic, Calidus Nott, and a man of magic can accomplish anything. He's a necromancer, Nott, and a very powerful one, Lucius said. How powerful? I fought Stephen Strange once. That boast got everyone's attention. Not many people could claim to have encountered the Sorcerer Supreme and remained at liberty. While he had not fought much during the Voldemort War, when he had, he'd made a mark, easily dueling the Dark Lord to a standstill. And the implication had been that he was quite used to overpowering things that made the Dark Lord look like a gnat. Of course, no one had said this, or even thought it, anywhere near Voldemort. It was not good for one's long-term health. To even claim to have fought Strange implied ferocious power and deadly skill. I was young then, powerful and arrogant. I thought I could best him, Gravemoss said, standing and going to the window, looking out at the cold woodland where frost sparkled in the moonlight. I was also foolish. I thought no mortal was a match for me. I was wrong. He was my match, easily, and far my superior in skill. Now, matters are different. You think you can defeat him? It will not be easy, but yes, I can. I doubt you've learned enough in, 5 years to make you the equal of the Sorcerer Supreme? Avery said derisively. Gravemoss looked like he was no older than 30. Not in 500, Gravemoss said. He chuckled darkly at the shocked expressions. I am not mortal. I do not age like you. And the Sorcerer Supreme does not age, nor has he since he took the title in 1645. And he is a time traveler. The Death Eaters exchanged looks. They'd known that Doctor Strange did not age. The fact that he'd been around since the early 17th century and had looked around 43 since 1645 was another matter. Some very select wizards, such as Armando Dippet, former headmaster of Hogwarts, had achieved similar ages, living in Dippet's case to 292 years old. But unlike Strange, they looked it. No! Greyback barked. Excuse me, Lucius said coldly. Gravemoss raised one thin eyebrow. Greyback stood, kicking his chair back. He was a tall, broad, hairy man with strength that verged on superhuman and teeth that verged on public health hazards. He glared at the Hydra contingents. I know what you're doing, Malfoy. I'm not listening to humans, and nor on my pack, he snarled. Why would they command me? Unfortunate, Lucius murmured. He glanced at Von Strucker, who raised an eyebrow, then flicked his gaze to Zemo, who was relaxed in a very dangerous manner. Lucius's lips twitched, and he nodded slightly. Baron Zemo was not just any muggle, as Lucius well knew. Greyback was about to get a very nasty surprise. He idly drew his wand and flicked it, moving everyone back and leaving Greyback isolated. Before the werewolf could react, Zemo was on his feet, moving like a predator. Greyback, recognizing a challenge when he saw it, growled threateningly. Then he lunged. He was fast, but not as fast as Zemo, who moved in a purple blur, striking the werewolf hard across the throat with the edge of his palm, ducking beneath and spinning away from the lunge before delivering a powerful kick to the back of Greyback's head that slammed him face first into the floor, and would have killed an ordinary man. Greyback rolled over and froze. Zemo's sword was at his throat. This blade, Zemo said coldly, speaking for the first time. His German accent was light and almost unnoticeable. It is infused with many things, including silver nitrate. If I may demonstrate. He touched Greyback's throat with only the flat of the blade. There was a hissing sound, and Greyback yelped in sudden pain. He took it away. I am only sparing you, as I do not think Herr Malfoy would like your blood staining his floors. He leaned down to the humiliated werewolf. And to answer your earlier question, the reason we command you is because we are better than you. He sheathed the blade and made his way back to his seat without even looking at Greyback. Lucius raised an eyebrow. Would there be any more problems, Greyback? There was a long moment of silence, and Lucius idly wondered if Zemo would object to taking Greyback's head as a souvenir. It would certainly solve a few staffing issues. No, Greyback said eventually, slinking back to his chair like a beaten cur. Good. Is that all? Nod asked. Not quite, Von Strucker said, as right on cue, the Chimera let out a gigantic roar and attacked something. One of your peacocks biting the dust, Lucius? Avery asked, amused, to chuckles from the other Death Eaters. Lucius fixed him with a cold look and said nothing. Meanwhile, Gravemoss cocked his head as if listening to a symphony only he could hear, and laughed. "Oh, this is wonderful," he said gleefully. "Barons, wherever did you find him?" Von Strucker smiled. "Little is hidden from Hydra, Lord Gravemoss," he said, as the roars turned to yelps, whines, and cries of leonine pain. Then were silenced. The Death Eaters froze as one. Only one wizard in history had succeeded in killing a chimera, and had died falling from his flying horse. There was another roar. That was the Nundu. Soon enough, it too was abruptly silenced. Lucius gave Von Strucker a reproachful look. That Nundu had been expensive. Von Strucker smirked as if to say, "At least you don't have to worry about feeding it anymore." "Lucius," Avery whispered, "what in Merlin's name is out there?" It was Gravemoss who answered. "Why, Shield's worst nightmare, of course," he said, smiling. "The Ice Warrior." Footsteps, smooth and sure, began to come up the corridor. The Death Eaters were reaching for their wands, some trembling. "The Sleeping Death." Closer now. "The Shield Breaker." "Europe's Terror." Nearly there. "He has many names, as have I. But the one many will know him best by is another matter." The door slammed open. There were two thumps as the head of the Chimera and the head of the Nundu landed, rolling into the middle of the room, caught in their last moments. Was that fear on their faces? Lucius's lips curled as the blood seeped into the fine Persian rug. Oh well, that was why one had house elves. All eyes were drawn to the figure who had carried them in. Von Strucker and Gravemoss were smiling, because they knew who this tall, masked figure was. Zemo was probably smiling. It was a little hard to tell with him. Lucius idly studied the man before him. He was tall, powerfully muscled, with shoulder-length dark brown hair, and he held himself with supreme confidence. His skin was pale. His eyeless gaze, hidden behind a pair of black goggles set above a charcoal gray face mask, swept the room. Since he didn't kill anyone, Lucius could only assume that he was satisfied with what he saw. His clothing, a Muggle combat vest and combat trousers, three-quarter length coat on top, was solid black and gray, thick and strong, designed solely for practicality. Though it managed intimidating, too, a fact only helped by, if you were sharp-eyed enough, the fact that you could see the gleam of his metal left arm. He was heavily armed, and Lucius would bet, based on his limited experience of Hydra and S.H.I.E.L.D. senior agents, that for every weapon he could see there were at least two he couldn't. "Lucius, what in Merlin's name is this creature?" Nott whispered. Lucius smiled. "Baron von Strucker, if you would." Von Strucker smiled. "Gentlemen, I would like to present you the tool of the Avengers' destruction. Hydra's greatest secret weapon. The Winter Soldier." Hogwarts, Steve decided, was reassuring. Unlike almost everything else he'd encountered in this new century, it had hardly changed. The high, cool stone walls, aged yet giving an aura of majestic invincibility, were as strong and tall as before. The towers of the castle scraped the roof of the world, reaching up into the skies as their inhabitants sought to understand the mysteries of the world around them and of the stars. So Steve would have thought if he was of a more lyrical bent. As it was, he was just pleased to finally find a building that looked almost exactly the same, and one he could navigate around without asking directions. He was, of the Avengers, probably the most familiar with Hogwarts, Thor excepted. Clint and Natasha, unless there was something they weren't saying, quite likely, but that didn't mean they were going to say it, had never been. The same went for Tony and Bruce. Loki had, by his own admission, last been in the school, save for remotely spying on his brother when he attended, in the early 11th century, and remembered it well. It was, Steve had long since decided, weird to have friends who talked about Alfred the Great, Richard the Lionheart, and Leonardo da Vinci, as if they had been chatting to them just last week. Whereas, unlike the rest, he had spent a good 2 years here during the war, visiting Hogwarts on and off, using it as a base to rendezvous with Albus Dumbledore and the other allied wizards, and to strike at Hydra bases in Northern Europe. In the process, he got to know its halls and its transfiguration teacher rather well. Albus was, in some ways, very like Thor, in that he was very kind, warm, and friendly, if a little odd, but heaven help you if you got on his bad side or hurt someone he held dear. And unlike the headmaster, a slightly bumbling bureaucrat called Armando Dippet, he could do two things that earned him Steve's deep respect: command loyalty through respect and love instead of fear, and see the good in people, no matter how far they seem to have fallen. Which had, Steve thought, made his mistrust of a star student, head boy, and Hogwarts heartthrob Tom Riddle all the more surprising. Or maybe it didn't. Maybe, unlike the other teachers, he saw past Tom's charm to the creature underneath. Steve was deeply reluctant to cast any man or woman as evil, but Tom had left him sorely tempted. There was a cruelty to his smile, an unsettling gleam to his eyes, and a slight sneer he affected whenever in the presence of one of the Muggle-born witches and wizards or the Commandos, or had until Bucky had caught him and his friends bullying a Muggle-born. With the help of Charles Potter, Bucky had given the boy a well-deserved thrashing and lesson in manners. The fact that Charles, who had been maybe a year younger than him, had gone on to be the father of one of Steve's teammates, who just so happened to be technically 21 when he sort of died, 33, the age he would be if he hadn't sort of died, and well over 1,000 years old, the age he actually was, made his head hurt. Steve had decided it would be easier not to think about it, and instead resolved to tell Harry a few stories about his mortal paternal grandparents. "Stephen Rogers?" an incredulous voice said. He turned to see a woman in late middle age. Witches and wizards, it seemed, aged slower, standing at him in outright shock. He didn't recognize her. No, wait, hang on. He did. "Minnie?" he asked incredulously. He smiled. "You haven't aged a day." Minerva chuckled. "We both know that isn't true, Steve," she said fondly. "You, on the other hand, look exactly the same." She sighed. "It's only been 3 years for you, hasn't it?" Steve nodded. "Yeah. Look, Minnie, I'm so sorry about Bucky." "He went out the way you would have wanted to," she said firmly. "Fighting. You did all you could, and I could expect no more from a man who loved my fiancée like a brother." Steve nodded again. "Thanks, Minnie. I just can't stop beating myself up about it." "You aren't alone in that," she said quietly, coming up alongside him. "Come, you're here to see Albus, aren't you?" "I am. I wanted to catch up." She smiled slightly. "I'll walk you there. He's looking forward to your visit, as are Phileas and Rubeus." "They're still around?" Steve asked, matching her stride. "Yes, and in Hagrid's case, as large, indiscreet, and warm-hearted as ever," Minerva said. "You mentioned that you are not being alone in beating yourself up," Minerva said briskly. "Yes, over Lily and James, no less." Steve took a moment to think, then recognized the names. Harry's mother and Thor when he'd been human. "Oh?" "Yes, you see, they're secret keeper. I trust you've had the Fidelius explained to you?" "Yeah, I think only one person can tell others the location of whatever you're hiding. Apparently it's very complex." Minerva nodded. "Exactly. I knew their secret keeper, Peter. I was his head of house for 7 years. I should have known he'd gone bad. I always knew he was weak, easily led, and exactly the sort of person who would gravitate to the biggest bully in the playground, if you follow me," she said, sighing. "I should have known." "You had no way of knowing, Minnie," Steve said gently. "The way Thor, James, tells it, he, Sirius, Remus, and Peter were his closest brothers. If none of them picked up on it, how could you be expected to? How often did you talk to him after you left school, anyway?" Minerva blinked. "Maybe a dozen times. Never for long." She caught Steve's meaningful look and chuckled slightly. "Yes, I know. I see your point. But still—" "I know. One thing I've learned, from Tony Stark of all people, is to live in the present, not the past," Steve said. "Coming from a guy who's only a few minutes away from heart failure and relies on a giant battery to stay alive, it's quite a strong message." Minerva nodded. "I will try."
Mr. Stark sounds like a wise man. Surprisingly so, considering his...
Eccentricity?
Yes.
He's completely mad, and sometimes infuriating. But he's also brilliant. He's even cleverer than his father, Steve said. I got a raised eyebrow. Minerva had known and been reluctantly impressed by Howard Stark's genius. Howard improved things, but he didn't really think outside the box. Tony looks at the world sideways, and it shows. He also has a good heart, even if he tries to hide it.
The first part sounds much like Albus,
Minerva said dryly. I'm willing to bet Albus doesn't get drunk and try to build time machines in his lab, Steve said. Minerva blinked.
He does that?
Yeah, the scary part is they have a good chance of working. Minerva considered the effects of such experiments.
How is Avengers Tower still standing?
She inquired, fascinated. I have no idea, Steve said flatly. Pepper probably has something to do with it. He looked up. They'd reached the gargoyle. Trips tended to be shorter when passed with conversation. He reached and formally shook Minerva's hand. Minnie, it's been a pleasure.
The pleasure was all mine, Steve, she said, and if you ever want a cup of tea and chat, my door is always open.
Steve smiled and nodded. Thank you, Minnie. You're always welcome up at the tower, he said. He frowned at the gargoyle. What's the password?
Cockroach cluster,
Minerva said. The gargoyle stepped aside.
See you around, Steve.
You too, Minnie. You too. Steve smiled as he ascended the stairs. Some things stayed the same, of course. The same could not be said for people. Not appearance-wise, anyway. Minnie was still beautiful, but she wasn't the captivating young beauty who'd caused Bucky to walk into a wall at first sight. People changed. It was a fact of life. He just hadn't changed with them. He knocked politely on the door.
Come in, Steve, Albus said.
His voice, that was the same. Strong, warm, and comforting, as it had always been. Another thing that stayed the same. Of course, Albus Dumbledore himself had changed. His once bright auburn hair, colored by a touch or five of gray, was solid white, and his beard was a good deal longer. His face showed the signs of age that one would expect from a man who was around 115 years old. But his posture was still tall, and his eyes twinkling were as alert and piercing as ever.
Well, I must say it is a surprise, Albus said, to see you in the flesh, not having aged a day.
He shook his head in wonderment.
Despite all the years that have passed, you still look exactly the same.
I have the serum to thank for that, Albus, Steve said.
Indeed you do, Albus murmured. We have your serum, your blood, to thank for many things.
Steve frowned. Albus?
Oh, nothing. Just the ramblings of an old man,
Albus said casually. Steve knew that they were anything but. The Albus Dumbledore he had known had been one of the greatest and deadliest minds he had ever known. The only difference between then and now was that this version had over 60 years more experience. Nevertheless, Albus probably wasn't going to talk, so he dropped the subject. "How have you been?" Steve asked.
Growing old, Albus said. Watching many a student leave the school and find their future, for good or for ill.
When did you become headmaster? Steve asked. I mean, Dippet looked like he was going to stay on forever.
He retired in 1954, Albus replied, and took up a life of leisure. I believe he passed away 5 years ago.
Steve sighed. He hadn't particularly liked Dippet, though he hadn't disliked him either. The man had been decent, but secretive, and mistrustful, as well as being somewhat disdainful, though he never said as much of Muggles. Still, that was another man who had died before his dubious return from the ice.
"Oh, don't mope, Captain Rogers,"
a brisk voice said. Steve's head jerked up. The portrait of Armando Dippet was giving him a reproving look. "Sir," he said, and saluted. "Sorry, didn't see you there."
"He's a courteous one."
A former headmistress, Dilys Derwent, said approvingly. "Of course," she said to her uninformed fellows, who had died after Steve's disappearance.
"He always was. They breed them polite, the colonies."
Steve snorted, both at the term colonies and the polite line. While he had been raised to be polite, Dilys had clearly never met Tony Stark. Or Howard, come to think of it.
Captain, you've been granted the gift of a second chance, Tippet continued. Do not waste that gift by sighing over what was and what could have been. Agent Carter would not appreciate it.
Steve twitched.
I don't know what you mean, sir. My boy, I've heard better lies from first years, Tippet said dryly. I was alive for over 10 times as many years as you have already seen, and I was headmaster of Hogwarts for 45 years, after teaching for 32. I saw what was going on between you two the moment you walked into the room. So did Albus.
Albus's eyes were twinkling, and Steve gave him a somewhat betrayed look. The twinkling did not abate. At all.
She's in a better place now, Tippet said gently, and I doubt she'd want you to ruin your life by crying over her and your rascal friends. In fact, I think she would have some rather harsh words on the subject.
Steve winced slightly and nodded. Peggy would have chewed his ear off.
You have a point, sir. Of course I do. I'm a teacher,
Tippet said, sniffing.
Take a cue from that Potter boy. He lost his wife and discovered he was the god of thunder and seems to have turned out a well-balanced, if mischievous individual.
Mischievous was pronounced like it was a cardinal sin. Exactly like, in fact, if Steve remembered his youthful confession sessions correctly.
Perhaps you're being a little harsh, Armando, Albus said. After all, James has over 1,000 years of memory and a family to support him. That may be so, Armando acceded. But it's still no excuse to mope. Sir, The next words out of your mouth, my boy, had better be, yes, sir, thank you for sharing your wisdom with me, sir. Armando said sharply. I will settle for yes, sir. Yes, sir. Good boy. On the topic of people lost, there is still one person from that time who still lives, Albus said. Steve blinked at him. Sergeant Howlett, also known as
the Wolverine, Steve said, and half smiled, remembering the tall, taciturn soldier who, along with his disturbingly feral brother, had often been attached to Commando's missions. If anyone survived, it would be him.
And he hasn't aged a day, much like you. His healing gifts have kept him young, Albus said.
Steve stared at him in shock, as a painful hope rose within him. Hope that he could meet someone he knew who understood. Understood what it was like to go on without changing while all the world decayed and fell apart around him.
Where is he? When I last checked, he was in Westchester, New York, Albus said, but I wouldn't get your hopes up.
Albus?
He has amnesia, Steve. Total amnesia. While you are better placed to investigate than I, his claws are now coated in metal, and he was involved in a project called Weapon X, which I suspect has something to do with both matters. Albus said quietly, I am sorry.
Steve resolved to investigate. Maybe Clint and Natasha would know something. The world really has changed, he said quietly.
It always is, Steve. By the time I met you, I was musing over the fact that the world had changed from my childhood. Well, if you suggest that the most dangerous Dark Lord of all time was just on the rise and would ally with the Muggle Imperial power, you would be laughed at, Albus said. So, you reckon Grindelwald is more evil than Voldemort? Steve asked.
He'd been told that Voldemort was considered the most evil and most feared dark wizard of all time.
No, I feel to this day that while he was capable of horrific things, Gellert's intentions were not evil, Albus said.
He sighed.
But the road to hell is paved with good intentions, especially ones that were so easily twisted. I also believe that he was simply more dangerous than Voldemort could ever be. Gellert Grindelwald's dominion extended from the very southern tip of the Arctic Sea to the warm coast of the Adriatic, and from the Bay of Biscay to the depths of Russia. His magical empire extended much further and was far more ensconced at its height than Adolf Hitler ever dreamed of, Albus said. If he had not been stopped when he was, it would have taken the full might of the wizarding civilizations of Africa, Asia, and the Americas to defeat him. The power he wielded towards the end was immense, enough to stalemate and even defeat the Sorcerer Supreme, which he did once. The battle between the two was cataclysmic and did more to devastate Berlin than any number of Allied bombing raids. He looked distant. It was a month before Gellert and I fought. He was weakened. He underestimated me. to his cost. Sorcerer Supreme, Steve said, vaguely remembering someone by that title. Stephen Strange. You would have met him a couple of times. His main concern was stemming the tide of Gellert's allies from beyond this world, Albus said, so he was not often seen on the battlefield, but when he was, it was generally spectacular.
Steve nodded, remembering a tall man with a goatee beard, white temples, and dark hair who wielded magic in a way Steve wouldn't see again until he saw Loki in full flow.
He's still around, you know.
Really? Where?
No one knows. I saw him a few years ago. Unfortunately, he was rather close to Harry's mother, Albus said. Much like Nicholas was. He keeps to himself these days.
That's a pity. He'd be a good candidate for the Avengers, Steve said.
He probably would be, Albus agreed. Sherbet lemon?
He said, offering the dish. Steve ate one and made a face involuntarily. Albus chuckled.
They aren't for everyone, he admitted. Now I must ask, is Mr. Stark as much like his father as I think he is?
He's very like the Howard that I knew, but not like the Howard that Tony knew, Steve said eventually.
Your disappearance hurt him badly, he said quietly. Howard did not easily make friends, and you and Peggy were two of his closest. When Peggy left us in 1962, he went into a downward spiral I do not think he ever recovered from. He became cold, aloof, and distant, something that persisted until his death.
Yeah,
that would make sense from what little Tony says, Steve said. The two didn't get on. I'm not surprised, Steve. Even at the age of 10, Anthony was showing signs of being cleverer by far than his father, and if there was one thing Howard could not stand, it was being beaten, Albus said gravely. That said, he did love his son. He was proud of him, and felt that he could take the world into a brighter future. He was just very bad at expressing it.
Steve nodded. Howard had been charming, as demonstrated by the number of girls who flocked to him, and boys, too. Howard's taste had not been discriminatory, though he seemed to prefer women, and since he was discreet about it, no one really gave a damn. Or if they did, they were wise enough not to piss off men who could design a weapon to kill them from a rubber band, an ice cube, or two, and a toothpick in about 2 minutes flat and leave no evidence behind. And that wasn't even taking into account the fact that Howard was so rich and influential that he was pretty much untouchable. But for all his charm, he'd been fairly emotionally inept. Tony was cut from the same cloth, though he was somewhat better with his emotions than Howard had ever been. Maybe because he had to be. Steve couldn't tell. You know Tony?
We met a few times when he was young, and I was keeping in contact with Howard and the Commandos. I doubt he remembers me, Albus said, though I did meet on 1 or 2 of the trips a wonderful young man by the name of Charles Xavier, who said one of the wisest things I'd ever heard. You would appreciate it, I think.
What was it?
Any dream worth having, he said, is a dream worth fighting for,
Albus recited.
His dream was, well, it was not unlike the ethos I try to instill in my students, to question assumptions, confront prejudices, and be tolerant to your fellow man and woman.
I think I'd like him, Steve said thoughtfully.
I suspect you would, Albus said. I dare say you'll run into him sooner or later. He is Anthony's godfather, after all.
What? He never said, Steve said, then paused and considered Tony Stark.
I suppose I shouldn't be surprised, he said slowly. Anthony always has been somewhat private, Albus said, about what he thinks matters.
Are they close? Steve asked, then shook his head. No, I'll ask him myself. Albus nodded.
A wise choice, he said. Now, on the subject of godfathers, how goes Loki's progress in attempting to find the elusive Sirius Black?
He says he's working on it, but a whole bunch of factors mean Sirius is hard to pin down, Steve said. Albus nodded thoughtfully.
Understandable, if a little disappointing, he said. How is Harry settling in at the tower?
The conversation continued for some time in that vein, until the sun set and Steve glanced at his watch. With a final goodbye and a request to pass on his regards to Hagrid, he'd meant to see him, but time got away from him. He called Loki, who promptly teleported over.
I trust it went well,
the older man asked.
Yeah, it did. Thanks.
Steve said, before drifting back into contemplation. Loki nodded and teleported them both back to the tower, where Steve spent much of the evening thinking. Armando was right, he decided. Peggy would have kicked his ass 6 ways to Sunday and back if she saw him like this. And Bucky, he chuckled.
Bucky would never let him live it down.